Okay, thank you and welcome. My name is Chris Blattman. I'm a professor here at the Harris School. I'm an economist and political scientist, and I study violence. And I first met Gary when I was a graduate student. Last year, I had my last year of my PhD, and I had something written up in the newspaper or something like this, and this person reaches out to me. I have no idea who this guy is, and he says, "You're going to be in Chicago." It turns out I'm going to be in Chicago. We meet, and this just turns into like 20 years of not just admiration, but actually a lot of my career has been studying programs to interrupt and stop violence of various natures, including programs very similar to and close to Gary's work. So he's certainly inspired a lot of my work, and I'm really delighted. So when he was telling me that he wrote this book, I immediately said, well, I'd like to have him out here to talk about it. And so I'm really glad that you guys can join us today. I will introduce, Gary has this really unique background. He's an epidemiologist, he's an MD, and he's from Chicago, and he came back, and as he's going to tell you, he came back after fighting HIV and AIDS and tuberculosis and other epidemics around the world, especially in sub-Saharan Africa, and he came back to Chicago, and this book really is about his work and how he brings this really unique lens. And so I've learned a lot from it, because it's definitely not a lens that I learned as a political scientist or an economist, so I'm glad to have it here. So Gary is going to talk. He's 93 slides, so I guess you can talk very quickly or something for about half of our hour here. And then he's going to join myself and Selwyn Rogers, who I'll introduce at that moment, for discussion. We'll chat for maybe 10 or 15 minutes, and then we'll open it up to audience Q&A. So thank you very much, and help me in welcoming Gary to the podium.
Yeah, thanks, Chris. And Selwyn, thanks so much for joining us today. And I appreciate your hosting me here. So the book that we're talking about today is a practical book, but it's also an educational book. And it reframes violence as an epidemic disease. And that's part of what we're going to be talking about today. And it also shows that managing violence as an epidemic disease works. And so this is a transformation of our thinking about violence as a moral problem or of bad people. And I'll also take you through some of how that works within us as actually a brain phenomenon of how we do what other people do and how our brains get hijacked into violence. And there's quite a bit in the book about the details of that I won't have the time to go through. And I'm also going to show you how the violence of many of the forms that we associate with violence, like mass shootings and even war and authoritarianism itself, are also forms or mutations of this same disorder, just different syndromes of it. And so that's the essence of what I'm going to say, and it's the essence of what the book has to teach. And it has within it stories of mass shootings and stories of community violence in this country and in other countries. And it takes us into Iraq and Syria and the North Korea, almost nuclear war, and it takes us, of course, into Chicago, which is where this was piloted. The whole approach was piloted here in this city in the year 2000. I arrived back in this city in 1995 after spending 20 years with the World Health Organization and other organizations working first on tuberculosis in San Francisco and then in Somalia, where I moved, and then cholera there that emerged, and then HIV/AIDS, where World Health picked me up and assigned me to the 13 countries in Central and East Africa. So that was my background, and coming into violence anew and not really expecting even to work on it. So I'm going to carry you through just the main highlights of this, but I want to tell you also that the book has within it solutions for almost every syndrome or almost every type. And it also has a whole program there of what you can do, and it outlines how epidemics are managed. So this is the story of the 14th century plague, when people were blamed and no one knew what to do, and people didn't want to go into these neighborhoods until we figured it out, along with leprosy and typhoid and typhus and a whole bunch of other disorders that were blamed on people, until we started to apply something called science and discovered that there was something invisible going on. And when we did that, the world changed. This really started in 1884 with Robert Koch, and we tell his story as well. And when we began to understand these diseases, that's when we began to do different things. Even though we had no vaccines, and even though antimicrobial agents weren't available until, frankly, the middle of the 20th century. But just understanding them gave us a lot of new ways to go. And they include some of the things that we now use in basic epidemic control as what epidemiologists, not just epidemiologists, but especially epidemic control specialists do. And these are the people who trained me, first in TB and then in some of the other diseases. And I got a chance to be mentored by the people who worked on smallpox, who were largely my teachers. And so let me just take you through there. Everything about violence meets the definition and all criteria and even the sub-details of an epidemic disease. These are the main criteria: epidemic waves, clustering, and transmission. And these are some examples of epidemic waves. And you would not be able to tell what these waves are if these graphs did not have headlines on them. But these are, one is a standard infectious disease, to which there was a campaign that eradicated it, and the other is violence. I'll go back there. Both of these are 20th century, and the second is the U.S. Here's another type of an epidemic wave. This has to do with point sources, and you see a second peak. You don't know what it is. Here's another one with second peak. And so what are they? A standard infectious disease, and violence, also an infectious disease. And the second peak for cholera was a new group of refugees that showed up and came into camp, and they were newly exposed. Exposure is the relevant factor in, as you know, COVID or measles or TB or anything, whether you're exposed. And then secondly, Rwanda here is a genocide. And this, suddenly people who were hiding were found, and they became newly exposed. These are mapping killings. And so, likewise, the clustering. And this is what influenced me when I first came to Chicago 20 years ago, is these waves and these maps. I am looking at the same thing that I've been working on for the last 20 years. I'm looking at the exact same phenomenon, the waves, the clustering, and everything is met. All the criteria are met. And what about it leading to itself? Well, it turns out that there's 50 to 100 studies, I think it's up to 100, that it is a risk factor for itself. And that's the definition in infectious disease books of the difference between a communicable disease and a non-communicable disease, is whether it causes more of itself. And there's many ways for it to cause more of itself. Here's something that we worked on in 2011, summarizing the data. And the book has an enormous bibliography of the studies showing how violence leads to itself. And so this is what we're talking about here. And then it leads to more of itself. And this could be for COVID, for measles, or for violence. Basically, the way that epidemics look. They don't have to go this far. They could go, I don't know if you can see the pointer here or not. I can't. But it can go down one line, or it can spread this far, depending on how infectious it is. And so there's different means of transmission. You know, it could be from the mouth to the nose or mouth, or from the... Does this show up at all?
Yeah.
Really? Oh, okay. So it could be like this for COVID and measles and TB and flu and colds, or it could be from the mouth to the hand to the hand to the mouth and so on. Or for HIV AIDS, it would be the arrow a little bit lower. And all of these have different, but for violence, it's largely a mental. So now we're beginning to talk about exposure, and exposure has to do with how much of a dose there is in person at the left, but also on how close they are. And it's the same thing in your home. You think COVID, how much are they sick and how much are they spewing and how close are they to you? This is the business of proximity and dose. And here's the data on this, going from closer and closer and closer of proximity. And this is why we do contact tracing for you name it, for any infectious diseases. And that's what we do with violence interrupters in the field, is we find the person who is about to do a shooting or just had, and we interact with their friends. Exposure operates through largely starting with the brain. There's copying circuits in the brain, mirror neuron and mirror neuron networks. And these copying mechanisms copy anything. They don't know good or bad or right from wrong or healthy from dangerous. They just are copying mechanisms. And in fact, there's a lot of things in our brain that don't know right from wrong or dangerous from safe, including pain centers and reward centers. And this is the center of how violence gets transmitted. Copying plus, social reward of doing what your friends do. And this can take us anywhere. So I just want to spend a minute on an experience of studying people who had been exposed. These are young children who were asked whether they had seen, and their parents were asked whether they had seen violence or it was done to them, whether they had witnessed it, and so on. And then looked at them in the future as to what they did over the next several years. Now, they had the worst conditions that we know about. Housing project, poor schools, poverty in all groups. And it's the same thing, is that if you have all of those variables being terrible for you, but no one walks into the house with TB or with measles or with COVID, nobody gets it. And the more contact you have, the more you're likely to get it. And the same thing is here. So every single thing follows the rules. And it even dials like a thermostat, like a rheostat, there's even intermediate. So many studies on viruses having to do with dose. This works the same way. Now, not everyone who's exposed, like some of us, are susceptible. Not everybody who got COVID got disease, right? Some of them were not so sick, some were more sick. What's different? Susceptibility. What are the susceptibilities? Again, the same set of principles. Those are the susceptibilities. Susceptibility to TB is your immune system, same for COVID, and so on. Age and sex are commonly susceptibilities. Maleness is a giant susceptibility to this. It's 85 to 99%, depending on the syndrome. And males is the weakness of this disorder. But as you'll notice, grievance is powerful. Grievance and humiliation are what we hear about with every mass shooter, almost every mass shooter. The same thing for war. In fact, they have grievance. I mean, Russia had grievances about the fall of the Soviet Union. In Germany, there were grievances. The whole country had a grievance. And you can see in this country the acceleration of grievance, the causing of grievance. So these are the susceptibilities, and that grievance and this humiliation and not belonging and not being invited to the party, or being told that someone slept with their girlfriend, or being insulted, causes pain. Same center as physical pain is social pain. And that center doesn't know right from wrong, safe or dangerous. It just feels the pain, and you have to get out of the pain. And that's what dopamine does. Dopamine is a way out of the pain. And it also will get you to belonging and to social reward. What I'm describing to you is something we don't know about our brains, that we have to get out of this pain no matter what, whether it's physical pain or not. And if it's social pain, you know, and you're not belonging to your gang or group, and you're not going to be accepted, you're not doing what everybody else is, and everybody else is doing violence, guess what? You start to go up on this. However, just like so many biological mechanisms, they can be hijacked and overdo it. And that's what we're seeing now with the government. And we see it this many times, is that it isn't enough to belong. It isn't enough sometimes to be acknowledged. You sometimes need status and power. And this, as you know about dopamine, you can't get enough of the pizza, enough of the sex, enough of the drug. And that's the same thing with violence. It becomes insatiable. And so this cruelty and destruction becomes an insatiable property of the individual or the group. And in fact, they can even have fun as people get high on what they're doing. And this is what we saw in Abu Ghraib, we saw in Mariupol, we saw in the Hamas attacks in October 7th. And we can even see it now within this government, people enjoying themselves with violence. And this is what's happening. So we have a biological and a set of mechanisms for understanding violence of all forms. And so you can see that exposure to any of these disorders, contagious disorders, cause more, and violence is behaving along the same way as an epidemic. Now, here are some of the syndromes. I don't call them forms or types anymore. I call them syndromes of the same disease. Why? Because they transmit to each other. Just like you can have different, here's bone TB and meningeal TB and systemic TB and lung TB and all the different ways that AIDS presents in different places, but the transmission is the same. And that's the case here, because community violence not only causes more community violence, but all these other things. In child abuse, similarly, bullying, similarly. Here's something that Charlie Ransford and I put together, showing all of the syndromes and what they cause. And what you can see, which is so interesting, is that war causes almost everything, and almost everything causes suicide. Now, not in every person. It's just that exposure increases the frequency. We've all seen how mass shooters copy each other. We've all seen how suicide there's copying. But it's also something being picked up. And this explains things that are otherwise unexplainable. For example, why would someone who was abused as a child abuse their own child? They should be the last person to do it. Explanation: contagion. Same thing with violence in the family. Otherwise, why will people come back from war? Are they more likely to do violence against their spouse or against their child or in their community? Not everybody knows that 25% of mass shooters are veterans. So this is what's happening. You're having transmission of violence, no matter what you're calling it. And so here is one disease. One disease. Now, interrupting spread is the way of reversing any epidemic. So for violence, we have a new category of worker. It was invented in between 2001 and 2002 by the organization that I founded called Cure Violence. And there are now thousands of violence interrupters in this country, and hundreds of epidemic control groups going by many different names. The most common one is community violence intervention, but there's thousands of names now. And you may or may not know that there's a dozen cities in this country now that are at 60-year lows in numbers of shootings and killings. And the reason is, without any doubt in my mind, that they're using elements of this approach, one or more or all of the elements, including violence interrupters and community responses and the whole thing. Here is this is data from 2007, 100% drop in retaliations. Retaliations before and after drops. This is one neighborhood in Chicago. This is very interesting how the doubling of the intervention caused a further drop. There's all kinds of data on the more intervention, the more likely the response. Prison violence. This is from the Caribbean, Englewood. Baltimore. Here is a very highly impacted neighborhood in Baltimore that has gone about 5 or 6 times with streaks of 0 for 1 to 3 years. There are now about 25 communities that I know of in 14 cities in the U.S. and Latin America that have gone to 0. That's elimination for 1 to 3 years. Definition of elimination is no longer a public health problem or is going to 0 for a certain period of time. This was the most violent city in the world in 2014 with a rate of violence that was 10 times Chicago, not twice, 10 times. And this approach, 90% drop. It's now not in the top 40 cities. Here's a list. We have a much longer list of this, of places that have gone to 0. Here's some more data, which you can get off the Cure Violence website, so we don't have to look at that. This organization has worked in over 60 cities in over 20 countries, including in the Middle East. So this is where I really wanted to land, is on infections of the state. So there's a chapter in the book, chapter 8, which is called Infections of the State. It deals with things that other people call political violence. And I've kind of, and the way that I'm looking at this is that there are 3 strains. And one strain is one that attacks the state, here on the left. See this thing? Or that undermines the state. Another is what the state does against its own citizens, and frequently that is an organization or a government that also inflicts violence on another state. This is what I call authoritarian violence disorder. So this is the diagram, the construct of authoritarian violence disorder. Now, the way that I'm understanding this, not describing it, the way I understand this, is that this is not authoritarianism that uses violence. This is a syndrome of violence that has overtaken government and overtaken politics. It's overtaken. The dominant matter is the violence. Violence done within the country, violence done out of the country. Violence through multiple different mechanisms, through language, through government, the use of government, for example, ICE, through agitating various lone persons or as well as groups, largely against vulnerable groups, and then that spills into the rest of the community. The response to this has got to be an eruption in multiple spots. And we've seen some of the playbook being used here, including, for example, Minneapolis, which has had a very, very robust community response. The community response, there's a lot to say about it, more than I'm going to be able to say, but public education and community response were all that we had before we had violence interrupters. In the first neighborhood that we piloted this, in West Garfield Park, in the year 2000, quite a few years ago, all we had was community response rejecting it, condemning it and rejecting it, responding to every single shooting, and public education materials, flyers, leaflets, billboards, yard signs, and so on. Oh, I might come back here and just point out that in 2025, there were 7 countries outside of Iran of which there was bombing. The amount of activity in the communities themselves by the administration clearly qualifies. I want to add that, and I recommend everybody, it's in the book, which has a very robust dictionary, glossary, look at the dictionary definition of violence. Because the definition includes not just the use of physical force, but threat. In fact, I can't even begin to tell you how much went into a global approval of this definition. Threat, force, or power, the use of. We've seen threats against a lot of places and a lot of people, including a lot of congressional figures. Some of those at the very highest level are tenfold higher than they used to be. There have been threats against Greenland and Canada and Mexico and other places. Also in the definition of violence is not only an outcome of physical disability or death, but deprivation. So the deprivation that is expected from the food and healthcare cuts is expected to be 50,000 extra deaths a year. The deprivation that has already occurred as a result of the foreign aids cuts has already been about $700,000, 700,000 people, 500,000 to 700,000 people. And I met regularly with one of the people who is on top of this the most that I know, and he's believing that as well as, and the estimates are for 14 million people to die abroad. This is long out of sight, but it also mirrors famines of the past. So deprivation counts as violence. So we don't know what this is, but that's what that is, and it's again an epidemic curve. This is a curve of authoritarian governments since the turn of the century. So I'm going to quickly go through this, that there is a history of elimination of diseases. And this is the short version of it. It's described more in the book. Elimination, again, is just long periods. Measles was eliminated from this entire hemisphere until its recurrence recently here. And of course, smallpox is eradicated, and plague is rare, etc. Most of these diseases we don't think about anymore. The reason that we went from them overwhelming us to us we don't think about them anymore is that we understood them. It's the main thing that changed, is that we re-understood them. And this is, we know how to control epidemics. Behavior change alone, I'll tell you, in Uganda, when we got there, a third of the population was infected with a 100% lethal disease. In about 6 or 8 cities, and it was the same was true in Blantyre and in Lilongwe and Bujumbura, in many of the capitals. The reductions were able to occur to the point of between 70 and 85% behavior change alone. That's all there was for 15 years. I have in the book a section on child abuse, mass shootings, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. There are solutions for all of these. And when you look at the solutions, which are in all kinds of different journals, and like pediatrics and history and so on, when you look at what they did They did a part of the epidemic control approach, but they didn't call it that. They were doing either case finding or public education or shifting norms. And that's very cool and important because all of them can do better by adding the parts that they're missing and doing it better. Violence is not a human universal. There's 30 or 40 countries already with less than 1 per 100,000 deaths. So they're already in good public health shape. And we have a lot of evidence for and experience in dropping violence 80 to 90%, including in communities in Colombia and Mexico, which are written up in the book with their stories. And we've been able to take several communities to zero. And this is probably the most important thing. We have models for how to do this globally. The child mortality, Gavi, PEPFAR, AIDS, TB, malaria, or smallpox. We have models for doing global campaigns. So these are the elements of epidemic control. And the details of them, in fact, even how to do interruption is in the book. This is an important point, the isolation and containment. I can talk more about that when we're discussing together. But this is the most important thing, is to know this, is to see this not as bad people, no matter how much you don't like whatever it is in the US or Iran or Israel or Gaza or this group or gang or this cartel or something. It's to understand what's going on invisibly within them. And that's what we do in health. We operate differently. We see what's going on as a disorder, and we try to cool it down, the disease process, and we interrupt any spread that might happen. So it's entirely different. And it's because we now, and as one of my literary agent persons said, so I can't see it any other way now. And that's what we need to get to. We can't see this any other way. So this is where we've moved. Okay. Thank you very much.
Okay, Gary, you've just met. Selwyn comes from us from the other side of campus. He comes to us from the Trauma Bay and from the south side of Chicago. He's the founding director of the University of Chicago's Medicine Adult Level 1 Trauma Center, which has been in place now for 8 years?
Yes.
And so he sees the human consequences of this violence every day at an incredibly human level. But the Trauma Center is not just treating, as we're going to hear from Selwyn, the Trauma Center is not just treating victims as they come in for the physical trauma, but it has developed a tremendous number of outreach programs and in some sense, a set of programs designed to sort of stop this contagion. And it's a long-time, I think, friend and colleague of Gary's, and so it's a terrific person to have here. And so why don't we just, start maybe just Selwyn, your quick reactions. Gary's given us the epidemiologist's view. Violence is something that's spreading through exposure, retaliation, trauma, norms through the brain. You're seeing this from a very different vantage point. You're seeing it from the trauma bay in the hospital. What does violence look like from your side of the system? When someone comes into the trauma center after a shooting or stabbing, what to you confirms this public health model, and what complicates it?
Thanks, Chris, for that question. And thank you, Gary, for the 5 decades of work that you've been committed to improving our understanding to get to a solution. So on the sharp end of a knife or bullet, one of the things that has always struck me is that we view the trauma, the violent trauma, as an event, as something that happened. And it's easy to focus on physiology, restoration of someone's blood pressure, stopping bleeding. Those are all essential things to do to maintain or to afford that person an opportunity to, if you will, live another day and decrease their morbidity or harm from that assault. But we don't often zoom back and say, okay, what was going on the day before, the week before, the year before, the decades before, or the generations before that put that person at risk, which fully aligns with that Slutkin's framework of addressing violence as a public health problem for which there is infection control capabilities and a contagion element. When I have the opportunity to step back, if you will, from that acute traumatic event and meet people where they are after some of their physiology is restored, and you talk to them about their lived experience, it's incredibly striking how pervasive violence has been in their life, right? They know members of the family, extended community members who have been directly impacted by violence. And, you made a reference to a couple of things that made me think about movies along the way, but one of the movies that I've always loved seeing more than once is Saving Private Ryan. And when I meet a mother who's lost not one, not two, but three sons to gun violence, I say to myself, what type of life has that mother lived? And when I hear the resilience in her voice, how do you keep going? She says, I don't have a choice because I have other kids and grandkids and I got to keep going. And I often stop to think about how could that have been potentially interrupted using your framing. So, I thank you for your work, but it helps us frame the problem differently because too often the narrative, it's a bad person doing a bad thing that deserves to get shot, and that pisses me off when I hear that, because you hear these people's stories and you realize there's no morality to a bullet. The bullet doesn't care what you're good or bad, and there are too many stories of people who literally are circumstances of being in the wrong place at the wrong time with the wrong missile coming at them. So, reflection on my comments.
Yeah, I mean, this is, what, at one level, what you clearly pointed out from what the mother and the family had to say, they're immersed in exposure.
At a very high level.
Yeah. On the help side, when these guys, what are called community violence interruption teams or cure violence teams or epidemic control team, what they do is try to sort that out and help the whole family. When they're outside, when they're beyond the crisis, that mom needs support and help, and the whole family does. And that, I've heard a lot of stories of that. Obviously, there's more needed, for sure. But what am I talking about? I'm talking about, every one of those kids having someone who they're connected with to help them either back in school or with their services, and helping mom get support. We have not really put into place in what I was talking about enough about the surround of this, that interrupters and epidemic, this is what they like to do the best. They don't like doing all this emergency stuff. What they like to do the best is hold people's hands and tell them who to call, at any time of day or night, and connect them with so many help possibilities. And this is all built. You've seen this in this. The service sector is built a little bit, and the trauma care. There's a lot of hand-holding and connection with positivity that is part of the work.
Agreed.
So I
just want to say, before Selwyn came, we didn't have a trauma center on the whole south side before Selman came to this city, and everyone was screaming for it. No matter what, they were going down to Advocate. It was 110th Street or something like that.
And so going up to
Yeah.
Strozier or Northwestern.
So what Selwyn has put into place here as a whole service is a service to the whole city. It isn't just a trauma center or just a place of surgery, and it's been a giant step for the city. And there is a connection between what Selwyn does and what the other trauma services does with the community. People come into the hospital, interrupters show up there, they call the community, cool down the retaliations, and sometimes one shooting doesn't become 5 or 20. It's just the one because there's enough connection, and then there's a continued support of that person should he live, which is usual because of your work. Yeah.
Yeah, following up on that, 95% of people get shot in our hands survive. That's actually pretty good. We wish it could be 100, but it's not 100. Having said that, one shooting does lead to another shooting, leads to another shooting, leads to another shooting. It does, and it's often, unlike framing it as retaliatory gang violence, it's actually more likely interpersonal conflict that gets resolved with a gun as the mediator of the conflict, given our pervasiveness of firearms in our communities. And by community violence interventions and interruptions, the hope is that you can interrupt each of those subsequent ripple effects of a single shooting. And the work is hard, it's messy, it's not precise. And certainly over the 8 years that the University of Chicago Medicine's Trauma Center has been open, I've seen it, it's gotten more robust, but it's also under attack in light of what's happening at the federal level. So I have grave concerns that though we've made progress, and you mentioned many cities, LA, Chicago, Hartford, Connecticut, having historic lows of gun violence, I worry that the tide politically is turning away from the things that are actually working to get to historic lows, but I fear that we may have a resurgence, just like an epidemic.
It depends on support for the effort. The city and the state have been they've really kicked in like they hadn't years ago.
Let me push a little bit, Gary. I mean, as you know, I've spent a lot of my career developing programs in some ways that are tackling this problem, that tackle that emotional, vengeant, automatic response that, and trying to interrupt and trying to find, in some sense, new interventions that will interrupt in different ways. So I believe this explains a lot of violence, but actually I don't believe that this explains all violence. I think it explains, I don't know, I won't even make up a percentage, but that's because I think there's a certain amount of violence that's also cold and calculated and strategic. And so I'm just curious how you react to this, because I think back to a dealer I spoke to in Chicago who was talking, and he said very plainly, this is how I became a killer. He said, look, and he knew that, yes, there were times he was angry and there were times he was vengeant, but he said, look, the first time they stole my drugs, I realized, like, I'm surrounded by a bunch of powerful guys, and if I look weak, it's going to be open season on me. And so I need to do this in order to send a signal. And I need to sort of employ violence in order to actually reduce my risk of violence in future, right? And so, and that's a story to a political scientist and economist like me. That's a story of individuals or nations or villages or tribes or whomever in anarchy. There's no state, there's nobody there to sort of protect you. You're in a dangerous neighborhood. And there's a certain amount of violence that is in some sense, in that environment, can be strategically optimal. And there's no, so my sense is like that resembles, it looks like a contagion, but it's different. It's a different disease. It's a different diagnosis. It probably needs a different treatment.
So I'll tell you 2 stories on it. First of all, I don't buy it. So it's just not my and our experience. So here's the first experience I had with this. So we were in one of the early community responses in the city. We were passing around these leaflets and flyers and things like this, and it said quite clearly that, we're not interfering with your business. We're just this is about the violence. And this one guy said to me, "Thank you so much, but don't talk to us about the drugs." He said, we needed someone to talk to us about the violence, but don't talk to us about the drugs. And in many places, this is what you were able to separate out smoking from drinking, or drinking from driving, or something. We were able to separate it out. I'll tell you also that, so you probably know this or about this, or maybe you were even firsthand around this, but in Honduras, and also in Mexico, we're working with cartels. And they're very heavily involved in organized stuff. They use the word organized crime. Yeah, but and so this place, this story is in the book. You may have seen this already, or maybe you haven't read it. But this woman, Lourdes, this pastor, it took a long time to find her. She had access to both of these main groups. People know their names, their famous names in the newspaper and stuff like that. They cooled everything down, and they're still doing their business, but they're not doing their violence because we help them figure out how to do that. And it's to the point where one of the leaders actually made a speech at a soccer field. By the way, the soccer field was a place for dead bodies before it got converted into a soccer field again. And he made a speech there, and he said, I always thought I'd always have to do all of this violence, and I don't. And I always thought my son would have to be doing this his whole life. And I can see the way out of this. And so they figured this out. And even there's several street corners in this city, I don't know the situation right now, where it was decided, you'll do your trading and your selling over here, you'll do it over here, or you'll just send one guy to the liquor store on a Wednesday and you'll send these guys over on a Friday. We're able to sort it out. I mean, 100% probably not.
But to say, just because violence is strategic doesn't mean that it can't be sorted out. It just means it gets sorted out in a different way. And it operates through a different mechanism. You talked about a mechanism that's going through the brain, that's going through mimicry, that's going through automatic reactions.
It's not, well, you could call it automatic, but it's automatic until they're able to be interacted with to help figure out a different way, because they don't want to be doing the violence. They absolutely don't. To me, violence is the easiest epidemic ever, because the default position is that people don't want to be doing it and they don't want it done to them. I mean, I would have these private conversations with the toughest guys, and when they're not with their friends and having the posture and so on, they would rather be somewhere where they're not doing it and they don't have to do it if they wouldn't do it too. This is not my experience with other epidemics. I mean, I'm talking to people who, they don't want to have just 1 or 2 sex partners. So that isn't living. 5 or 6, this isn't life. To wear this condom thing, this isn't real. I'm not going to do that. The default position here is people don't want to. If you can help them figure it out by mapping it and talking with everybody and finding the right people and stuff like this. It's not perfect, but I think that even with this war right now, even with this war, these guys are just in a fix. No one's helping them out of the fix they're in. So what are they doing? They're in this, who can cause more damage to the other? Who can cause more damage to the other? No one's helping them. Well, there are people who I know who are trying to do that. But that's the way I see it. And that's the experience that I've had with this.
All right, let's take it to questions. I think we have a microphone here so that you'll be captured. And please introduce yourself.
Hi. Hello. I'm Alex. I'm a PhD student in economics here, being advised by Chris, actually. Thank you for the talk. And my question is, so what are your thoughts on theories of like deterrence, especially when we talk about like politics, right? That you should be investing in your military and maybe engaging in some wars to demonstrate strength as a way exactly to avoid, right, to prevent future wars. Do you think that this theory is all, I don't know, wrong? Or like, how do you see that, and how would you reconcile that with your framework? If you think that there is some that this theory is valid, that indeed investing in the military leads to some deterrence, how would you reconcile that with your framework, actually?
I mean, it's just the center of the problem. Is there, that's, I mean, I understand it, that people are feeling that they're safer that way, and it may be true for the moment, but it's really just, it's essentially a lack of having not just an understanding of the problem, but a functional system. So a functional system right now, let's say globally, if you were talking about that, there would be, or not just would be, there would have been people interacting with one country you might be thinking about, and the other countries around them that you might be thinking about, and this country that you might be thinking about continuously. Not ad hoc, not when all the shooting has already started, but even now, after the bombing or whatever has started, the operation has to have people who are trusted and credible, who each of the people who you might be thinking about in, for example, one of these war situations or the other, are the person who's interacting with them, or the people who are interacting with them, are helping them get out of the fix that they're in, confidentially and with trust. And this person is this person or this group is interacting with this person, this group are interacting with them, and they're not trying to bring them to the table. There's a system. That's the way epidemic control works. Is we have now in many of the communities here a system where there's a community organization, and then outreach workers and interrupters and supervisors and monitoring and so on. This is what we had in many countries that was able to control COVID or control AIDS that we set up and so on. This is the way the smallpox was eradicated. Ebola shows up all the time. It doesn't go anywhere. Why? Because there's a system of outreach workers and health workers who can stop it right away. We don't have this. In Baltimore, we had in some of the communities interrupters and a system, and in others not. Freddie Gray was killed. These other communities went on fire, not in these neighborhoods. Same thing, even you have a polio system, it helps with COVID. You have an AIDS system, it helps with polio. We don't have this, less for war than for anything. I don't know any of the syndromes that are less developed. I'll tell you one more thing about this. So Matt Waldman, who I work with, he's interacting with some of these conflicts right now. He just did a confidential study. Do you know Matt Waldman's work? On the mediators. He interviewed, dozens of mediators, war mediators, the best, okay? But they didn't have to put their names on it. And they were asked about their work. They basically said, we don't know, I don't want to say they don't know what they're doing. They said, we're not effective. I'm working with mediators now in 2 or 3 of these places with 2 or 3 groups. The mindset isn't even right. It's like they're not ready, was said, to solving something and bringing people to the table. We never say we're not ready or they're not ready. We're always there, unless the funds are cut. So that's why, what I ended with is that there are systems. UNICEF has systems. Save the Children has systems. There are arms and legs out there, but we don't have them. The UN also is ad hoc and underfunded. They don't have something that can, back to your question about deterrence, if they felt safe and we had, you know, a reacceptance of the charter and all kinds of backups, we'd be able to be spending less on what you're talking about. This is tens of trillions of dollars, not spent on climate and things like this, and other things.
Other questions?
Question? Thank you.
Local police, detriment or asset to the work that you were doing in this country?
Do you want to talk about
I'll
that?
have you respond first.
It depends on the person and the chief. My first response to this is that they're the backup to the backup. They're not the front edge to interacting with people, I mean, who are in a mess or who are thinking about something. And like Mom, I had 5 or 6 kids in the basement, including her son. They're loading up weapons. This is a story, I know, this one. And there's so many like this. She doesn't want to call the police on her son. Nor do people want to call the FBI or anyone else for a potential mass shooter. They want to call someone who they trust who can help them figure out what the situation is and stop it and cool it down.
Let me add one more thing. The police often respond after something has happened, not around prevention of something happening. And one of the challenges for much of community violence intervention work is how do you measure when something didn't happen versus how do you measure doing something after something happened? And so that leads to this imbalance, if you will, because the Chicago Police Department budget is somewhere on the order of $1.92 billion for, you know, if you will, maybe deterrence at some level, but also dealing with things after they've happened versus much of this work is about intervention before something happens. And it's always easy to critique the causality when you say, well, I can't prove to you that doing this didn't cause that thing not to happen. So I think that's part of the challenge around, if you will, the level of evidence. But please.
I want to just add something to this. When this is working well, and this is very, very common in the neighborhoods here, when I was working here, which I'm not now, is that the police would call the ceasefire or Cure Violence group and say, you know, are you on top of it?
Yeah, things are heating up.
Things are heating up. Are you on top of it? And the interaction would be, you know, we'll let you know if you're needed, or you know, we're on top of it, or we might need you to be a little more present over there, but we're still talking with them. So there is interaction, but there is now a recognition in many of the police forces that these guys can stop stuff.
And I just want to jump, I mean, look, I've worked in countries with no police, and it's not pretty. Like, it's a bad situation. And we have a tremendous, look, these things I think it's not an either or, I think these things are complements.
Yes.
And there's enormous amounts of like almost incontrovertible evidence across dozens and dozens of cities in the United States and beyond that more police generally leads to less crime, particularly less violent crime. And I myself have worked on some of these in Latin America, for example, because I'm interested. I spend a lot of my time on non-policing strategies, but I don't want to. I think these things have to work in tandem with policing strategies, and I find that, and so I think we need these things to be working together, as sometimes they do effectively in Chicago, partly because of, I think, you guys have hit them over the head for 20 years with success, and so now I think there's a better relationship, but it's not.
I agree. It's complementary. I mean, if someone breaks in my house, I'm calling the police.
Yeah.
That's.
I recall early on there was outright hostility at times. with the
That's accurate.
dealing with
Yeah.
Gary's organization.
That's accurate. There's
Yeah.
too many stories of that.
Yeah, and
actually.
it's not all gone.
I'm sure.
Hi, my name is Randy. I'd like you to talk about what makes a good interrupter, but I also heard you say something about women, particularly are effective in a way sometimes that men are not, or mothers or grandmothers, and you talk about that in the book a little.
Yeah, so this is beautiful. So, I mean, the best interrupter is someone who already is trusted by the person who and the group who they're interacting with, and then they're trained to how to cool people down and to shift perspective by time. There's a whole training. Actually, the steps of training are in, I think it's chapter 7 of the book, of what the steps are, what to do first and second and so on, that people can learn for themselves, but not in tough situations. So when you're organizing a program, no matter where, what country, or what problem, it's to do the research as to, well, who would you know, talking with the guys who are most active in violence, who would you trust? And then to find those people. So the selection is the main thing, and then it's basically about the relationship. Women are really running a lot of the community organizations. They're leaders in a lot of these community organizations here and in a lot of the cities. And we're trying to get a woman to be the new Secretary General of the UN. And I've just seen so much power from women, and I think I have a very simplified way of describing their power as an interrupter. And as a man, is that a woman can yell at you or tell you what you're doing wrong, and you feel like your mom's yelling at you or something. I mean, they can set you straight. They can, and you saw this in Minnesota too. You saw this in Minneapolis, where the role of women, pushing down on some of these guys, right in their face, and there's a tremendous power there. There's 2 or 3 women that are highlighted in the book. One whom I didn't talk about very much, Ajwa Amana in Uganda, but also Zainab El-Sawaj in Iraq, and Lourdes in Honduras. But there are a lot of examples now and Lupe of Cure Violence, who have really shifted the practices and the norms about violence against women as being no longer acceptable in situations that were then standard routine. Example, we had a project in Basra, Iraq, and also in Sadr City, and when things got negotiated, part of the negotiation was that somebody's daughter would be transferred into the other group for their use or whatever. And she put a stop to that. She said, we're not doing that anymore. She just declared it. And as I understand it, because I talked with her just less than a year ago, that stood up for 18 years. And similarly, there was something similar to that about in Honduras, about people in prison having the ability or the right to have women or girls brought in under certain circumstances, and that was put a stop to. And I'll just tell you this last one, that it was really the first one that I really saw, is Ajwa Amana, who was our public education person in Uganda. She held meetings with the women, so now a lot of things that were just teachers taking young girls or just policemen doing what they wanted with girls, this happens in this world. Now there was AIDS. And so they made decisions, community decisions, that this police officer, if he was told, if we heard anything like this, you're out of the village. And they agreed he'd be out of the force, and the same thing for the teachers, he'd be out of the school and out of the village. So this was decisions made, the way norms could be shifted by discussion, decision done. Just telling them. It came from the women.
Okay, so I'm going to have to invite all the remaining questions to come up and speak to Gary and Selwyn afterwards. We're going to hang out a little bit. But first I want to thank Selwyn for coming. Selwyn has a book. Selwyn has a book coming out July 7, Healing the Gun Violence Epidemic. And so I'm sure there's going to be a University of Chicago event for that. So you're on the list. So please join us for that. But especially join me in thanking Gary for sharing his book and all the tremendous work he's done.